help us today. So when we ask ourselves the question, how were the pyramids built? We also want to ask ourselves the question is, how can we learn from that today? What is it about what they did that could be helpful for us today as we think about the idea of organization and coming together and what we can do about that? So I want to kind of jump into that and talk a little bit about how the pyramids were built and what do we know, right? There are going to be some things we know, there are going to be some things we don't know as we walk through it. But I want to kind of talk about this because obviously the Great Pyramid and the Great Pyramid at Giza, the one that was for Khufu and then for his son Khafre and then for his grandson, they were significant, and it becomes the most iconic building, the most iconic part of ancient Kemet, of ancient Egypt were the pyramids. I mean, it's kind of goes without saying, it's hands down. It stands out among one of the most remarkable things that they did. It becomes iconic and representative of their culture and things we can learn about. And we think about it, when I had that conversation, just kind of thinking about it, these were tombs, right? They were building for eternity. They were building in representation of the deities that they believed in, that were expressions of God, that they were expressions of themselves. So as we start to think about that, Khufu, who has the greatest pyramid, the biggest pyramid, the first one that was built there at Giza, the biggest one, his name, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, his name literally is Khnum Kuefwi. And it literally means Khnum protects me. And when you think about Khnum was a deity of the cataract area. It was a deity of the southern part of ancient Kemet, the southern part of the Nile area, the cataract area. And he's talking about here his soul manifesting Khnum, and that Khnum is protecting him. So one of the things I think about is we think about the Kemetic reasons for building the pyramid and how the pyramids and how they did it. The motivation was spiritual. And when you are motivated by something you love, when you are motivated by something that touches you spiritually, that touches you on the inside, you would do things that seem like they're amazing to do. When you think about the level of organization, the level of skill that went into building these humongous monuments, with their hands and with their will, it's amazing. And it's hard for us today to get that level of organization together. It's hard for us to come together around something unless it really moves us, And there's nothing that moves us like spirituality, like love. It moves us like nothing else. So something that's remarkable. So as I think about that, and we start to think and jump into this concept and this whole thing right here, I want to talk a little bit about just the geography, because, Khufu's name, as we mentioned, is Khnum Kuefwi. So that's what Khufu's name is. It's Khnum protects me, right? And we know that the kings and rulers of ancient Kemet had more than one name. They had different names that they used. And so when you think about Khnum, you have to think about the lower part of Upper Kemet, right there where you see the first cataract over there. You see that the first cataract, that's the southernmost border of the traditional borders of ancient Kemet. When you get below the first cataract, you're getting into lower Nubia, you're getting into Nubia. And when you start to get around the third cataract, you're getting into upper Nubia, right? So this whole area of the cataracts, and where the ancient Kemetic people obviously knew that the Nile was coming from the south, that the source of the Nile was south of them, because the Nile flows from the south to the north. So obviously it's flowing in that direction. They oriented themselves toward the south, and they oriented themselves toward the source of the Nile, right? And so when you think about Khnum, he was a deity that really was there and that was considered to be ruler of the Nile, ruler of the area of the cataract, and that was bringing forth life, that was bringing forth water, that was bringing forth the resources that's so important to life. Obviously, if you're in a desert, and just period, water, the Nile. And so it's interesting to me that Khufu, who has this period way up there in beyond Hekapatah, there beyond Memphis and Giza, is having his name be something from a deity that's the Lord of the South, if you will. So the reason why I'm pointing that out is because Upper Kemet and Lower Kemet were connected. A lot of times when we think about Kemet and we think about the pyramids, we talk about them as if they were somehow not connected to the rest of ancient Kemet. Like somehow, the pyramids are these mysterious things that we don't know a whole lot about. We have more information about, we have more artifacts about ancient Kemet than probably any other ancient society. I mean, the museums are filled with ancient Kemetic artifacts, and the literature is abundant, right? So we have more information, but we sometimes just disconnect. We disconnect them for, whatever the reasons are. We disconnect the pyramids from the rest of Egypt's history, rest of Kemet's history. So when we think about this, it's important for us to understand that this was a united country and that a lot of things that were happening in the southern part and the people who were around them, so whether they were from the east or the west or from the south, these were all influences that were converging on this society that brought forth what we talked about. When we think about the people who made it, It's highly important to understand they were coming probably from different backgrounds. There were probably different people, even ethnicities, different people who were a part of the society. And that part that was coming right on the border from Nubia was a significant part of it. So we sometimes just disconnect the pyramids from the rest of Kemetic history, which why do we do that, right? There's probably reasons why we do that, but that's not something really we should do. We should think about that as we start to pull that through and kind of get it. And this kind of gives us a little bit of a just a look and an understanding how significant this area was. This is a huge area in the pyramids. It's a huge area, and you can see the very first part is Khufu's pyramid. So Khufu, Khnum protects me. That's his name. In the middle is his son Khafre, who is at this point in time he comes around. He starts to talk more about Ra and about the sun deity and the manifestations of God that are the force and the vitality that we talked about. And then in the far you see Menkaure, who is the son of Khafre and the grandson of Khufu. So you see this magnificent complex. It's not just, when I grew up, I heard people talk about the pyramids or just the pyramid. And sometimes I thought, as a young child that, maybe it was 2 or 3 of them there and not much else. But when you look at this is an entire complex. This is a whole complex here. There are not just the pyramids themselves, but you can see there's all kinds of structures that are there. I'll even give you like a better look at there. All kinds of structures that are there. There are other people buried than beside the kings. The Sphinx is obviously there, and the Sphinx you'll be able to kind of capture and see as we kind of get to the end of this. The Sphinx is obviously, it'll be very on the left hand side, at the very left hand bottom. You'll see that the Sphinx is there. There's so many things that are there that are part of us. And as we look at this and kind of capture this, there's a whole temple there. There are situations and information about how do you remember the kings. It wasn't just the fact that we had these huge, magnificent structures. It was also temples to remember them. So offerings were being done. Things were being done to help remember these kings and remember these Kemetic people, because there were nobles there. There were queens there. There's a whole complex and a whole society almost in this necropolis that had a lot to do with the afterlife and offering and providing offerings to the people who were buried there, the people whose tombs these were, and to remember them for eternity, right? So it's an amazing thing that they're still being remembered and that we have this. So as we kind of jump into this and look at this, we know that Khufu is the builder of the Great Pyramid. It was built for him in his honor. So, when did he live? He lived some 4,500 years ago. So just to give you an idea of the timing of it. So his dad, Sneferu, who was the first king of the 4th dynasty, reigned from about 2575 to about 2551. So 4,500 years ago, more than 4,500 years ago, that's what we're talking about. And 2,500 years before Christ. And then you have, after Sneferu, you have Khufu, and he is reigning from about 2551 to about 2528. So that's what he's doing, and that's kind of the time period in terms of that we're talking about. So the building of it becomes remarkable, right? We begin to see, so how did they do this? What techniques are they using? We're talking 4,500 years ago. They're doing this with hand, and they're doing this with will. When you have the will, the haru, the decision to do something, you do mighty things, you organize in mighty ways. So as we start to talk about and just kind of jump into some of the concepts here, I want to, talk about just some of the techniques they use and some of the things that we know. There's a lot of things we don't know, because it's not like we have, complete pictures that tells us everything in terms of how they got up in these huge heights, if you will, to be able to set the stones that they set. But there's some things that were interesting that we can find out and we can talk about. So if you look at this, you'll notice this one part about the pyramids. You'll see very rocky parts of the pyramids right now, but you notice that there's some parts of it that are smooth. And so they use techniques where they had these huge building rocks that helped to set the structure, the core, if you will, of the pyramid, and then they put casing stones on top of that. So just to give you like a little bit of a picture as you kind of look at that and get a little bit of a close-up view, you have these huge heavy stones, right, that form the understructure, the structure of the pyramid. And as that's kind of moving forward, as it's forming the structure of the pyramid, you end up having casing stones. So you can see this right now at the top of Khafre's pyramid. You can see that these huge stones are there. They form the core of it, but on the outside are these casing stones. And these casing stones are like the ability, they're literally stones that were cut. They were limestone that was put on the outside as a casing and a strong core that was underneath that's obviously still standing. And then you could place and fit these stones on the outside. You just had to shave them down, which obviously was not easy because you were doing this by hand, and polish them. So you had a polished finish and a polished look to the to the pyramids when they were, in their heyday, right? When things were alive and kicking. And you also probably had a capstone on top of it that could shine and reflect the sun for miles and miles around. And in fact, Hatshepsut talks about having in her obelisk that she built, having them kind of covered with electrum and having a capstone so that when the sun rose, you could see it for miles away. You can see Amen, if you will, Amen shining, if you will, and Ra shining off of her obelisk. Well, the same thing was probably the case when you came to the pyramids. You probably had a capstone on there. So you have this outer casing, and it's kind of amazing when you think about it, just in being able to take these huge stones and to be able to hew them into a way that forms the core of the pyramid, and then to take additional stones and put them on the outside of them and make them like a casing, file them down at the perfect angle. So those angles had to be met. I mean, you had to meet these angles. So it wasn't like this was done in a way that was not scientific. When you start to think about it and you put this all together, you understand that this was high science. This was something that, as we start to look at it, it was something that really starts to jump out at you in terms of just what they were doing and how they were building this, that you had to have a certain amount of science. So as you looked at this from a mathematical standpoint, when you look at Khufu's pyramid, the one that's in the forefront, the base of each four sides of the bottom, if you will, is about 230 meters long. And so, it covers at least about 13 acres or something thereabouts. So it's at least 230 meters long. So you have essentially 4 right angles right there. And those 4 right angles had to be done in a way where they are essentially surveying the area. So you imagine this area where they are coming to build the pyramids. First, you have to have surveyors. When I grew up, a lot of people would say, and maybe you've heard it too, maybe that's not the case now, but people would say that people who were enslaved people built the pyramids. They were not people who were enslaved. They were workers. They were skilled workers. This was a highly organized machine and effort to build these pyramids and to build this first one. So you had to survey this area. So one of the things you have to do is you first have to survey the area. You have to level it. In order to be able to build the structure, the area has to be level. And so you're dealing with some hills, some not perfectly level areas. You have to level this and you have to lay out the base. You have to procure the resources. So when we think about the resources that were being procured, those resources were coming sometimes as far away as Aswan, near the first cataract, hundreds of miles away. Most likely they used the Nile to help them transport that, hundreds of miles away. And when you get there, you have to have this base that's formed, and each of the bases, each of the 4 sides have to have right angles. So these right angles have to be, made. They have to be measured appropriately, because if you measure one side wrong, you're going to probably get it off. If you're off by hundreds of feet, obviously you're going to get this wrong. So they had very specific technical ways they did it. And, sometimes you hear people measure things in ancient Kemetic times in terms of cubit. What's a cubit, right? A cubit was traditionally the length of from your elbow to maybe the tip of your middle finger. So traditionally about 18 inches, what we might consider about 18 inches. So they're measuring things in very specific ways. And sometimes they might use measuring cords, almost like we use a measuring tape, and be very specific in terms of how they'd mark this. So they would have to have surveyors, they would have to have mathematicians, they would have to have markers to lay this out, and you have to have people to transport this. So not only did you have people who were doing the heavy transporting to bring the resources to the site, you also had to have people who were craftsmen in order to be able to hew the stone or to put forth the decorations or to do what they needed to do with the temples, because this was not just the pyramid by itself. These were also temples that were in place that they were building. So as I mentioned, they were getting these rocks from the southern part of ancient Kemet, way down there by the first cataract, and they're transporting it. And we have evidence from ancient Kemet of people doing similar things, talking about how they transported resources for other pyramids that we can talk about. So that helps us, give us some kind of idea in terms of what they were doing and how they were putting this forth. So as we jump into this and talk about this a little bit more, let's just kind of go through this. So we know they had a case, we know they had a core for that. We've kind of touched on the fact that this is a whole complex. This is not just one pyramid or one area. You have an entire complex here where you have the 3 pyramids that are built in succession for kings that come after Khufu, and you have the complex expand. You have queens that are built here. You have temples in which you're giving offerings to Khufu and to his subsequent nobles or kings that are there, and queens. You have the Sphinx that's there. So this is a whole necropolis where there was a part of a ceremony. It was meant to be alive. It was meant to be something that was carried on for years and years. And, I would assume now the ceremonies are not being done, right? Obviously. But the idea was for this to be carried on forever, that Khufu's name, Khafre, and his son's name would not be forgotten, and that the offerings would be continued forever. I mean, that was the idea. They were building for eternity, right? And so as we start to think about it, and it's kind of interesting when you think about it, that, the idea of wanting to build something forever, not just for a short period of time, thinking about living forever and how do you live forever. And we talked about this in an earlier episode, the idea of what you do for other people, your legacy that you leave is what allows you to live forever. So they were certainly looking at the pyramids from the standpoint of wanting to live forever, wanting to have a monument that lasts time. And certainly it's done that. I mean, you got to give them to that. Up to this point, it's still there. So they kind of accomplished that, at least up to this point. And so if you look at it, the internal part of the pyramid, if you just kind of look at that, internal part had shafts in it. So there isn't a whole lot to this. When you think about the pyramid, and when I initially thought about it, I just assumed that some of the things that you see in the Cam and that you see in other temples and other tombs of ancient Kemet that come after this, some that all these different, pyramid texts and the Persian Baru, what people call the Book of the Dead, all this is in the pyramid. The pyramid is pretty much stone with some shafts in it, and a burial chamber for the king, a burial chamber for the queen, and shafts that allow you to get to it, and some very, very remarkable, lining and mathematical and astronomical lining with true north, as well as with the angles, as well as with just how with the axis of the whole complex. So it's very specific, but it isn't a whole lot of pyramid text and writing inside the pyramid. It's not like you go there and you see thousands and thousands of lines of writing. You see pretty straightforward. This was a structure that was meant to represent in some ways Ra and the rays of the sun, and meant to house his tomb and to be forever and to be remarkable in terms of the way it was set up and how it was aligned with the heavens. I mean, that's what it was. It wasn't a whole lot of markings inside of it and writings that you might think. I thought it must be. The other thing to think about with respect to the pyramids is that they didn't come late in Kemet's history. It came kind of early. So this is the old kingdom. This is 4,500 years ago. It's not like this was built in the 20th dynasty. This is built in the 4th dynasty. Sometimes you think the remarkable things that people may have done or that they did in ancient Kemet, they must have come later on in their society. Not so. A lot of their literature, I mean, they had great things that happen all throughout. When you read it, literally they have great things that happen all throughout. But when it comes to these things, the pyramids, they were built earlier on in their civilization and in their society, not later on. It's another thing to think about that may be shocking to you. I didn't know when I was first looking at this growing up. So there's shafts inside there. And as I mentioned, they have these huge stones that are there, that are blocks that are being quarried and taken from places as far away as the southern part of Kemet. It's taken in other parts of Kemet. They're bringing these stones, and they're using barges, they're using towboats with remarkable amount of skill. And other people participated. It wasn't just Kemetic people. At times they're getting resources. They may be getting gold from Nubia for various things. They may be getting certain types of stone from along the border between Kemet and Nubia. They may be getting things from the middle part of Kemet and from various places. So you had other people's hands touching this whole effort to build the pyramids and the whole effort to build many monuments, many things in ancient Kemet. It was a group effort, if you will. It wasn't just Kemetic hands and Kemetic resources. There was an extensive trade network and an extensive network that went into building this. It really wasn't just a product of Kemet. It really was a product of all the people's hands who touched the resources that went into the building of these things. So as we talk about it, we kind of go on, you break this down, and some of it's kind of common sense, right? Because we don't know exactly. It's not like they wrote a book and showed us step by step what they did. They obviously did it, right? We see it, and we have some information that gives us, but you obviously have to have surveying. You have to have this location. You have to have a level ground upon which to do it. So you had to have surveyors, you had to have mathematicians, you had to have drafts people to help draw this up. Many times in ancient Kemet, you will find diagrams of things, diagrams of what they're about to write or what they're about to draw and what crafts people are about to do. And they have lines, very specific lines and grids drawn up, so that when they put forth a plan, they already had it gridded out. They already had almost like a draftsman-like plan to lay it out. It wasn't like they just did it off the whim. So we know that they had planning that went into it. And there was a foundation preparation. There was limestone, as I mentioned, used, and they were quarried from various areas in Kemet, kind of farther south than where Kemet was used. You have limestone, you have granite that were used, and the core blocks were kind of put in place, like I said, to form the main structure of the pyramid. And then you had these casing stones that would go on top of it. And you had interior chambers that had to be drilled through. And this is all done by hand, very skilled people. And these are workers. So when you think about it, the workers are using, chisels and hammers. These are skilled people. These are not people who are enslaved. These are not people who are unskilled. I really hate that term. I do not like that term, unskilled labor. Every labor is skilled. Anything you do is skilled. Something that one person can do, another person can't. And many people who will say that, I'm doing skilled labor and somebody else is doing unskilled labor. labor can't do what that other person is doing. You know what I'm saying? So the other person has a skill and a talent that's contributing to whatever needs to be done. And we shouldn't call labor skilled and unskilled. All labor is talent. All labor is ability. If you can't do it, you can't do it. So if you're doing it, you have the ability to do it, and we should respect that. So that whole idea of unskilled labor, I just kind of poo-poo that and get that out of there. We have every labor is skilled and is talented. So you have these massive structures. So you have tools. These transporting the stones are important. How do you get these stones up and down? And there's a remarkable piece of writing that took place in the 6th dynasty after the building of the pyramids, because the pyramids, as I mentioned, were built in the 4th dynasty under King Khufu and his son and his grandson. But there are other pyramids that were built in ancient Kemet. And as we look at that, one of the documents that tells us a little bit about how they do was the autobiography of Winnie. So I just want to pull that up real quick so you can take a look at it. This autobiography of Winnie was written during the 6th dynasty. And it comes from Abydos, so kind of like the upper part of the more northern part of Upper Kemet, if you will. And this and it was from his tomb, and he's giving his autobiography. And this was a gentleman who was an official under several kings. He was an official under several kings in the 6th dynasty. So one of the kings he was for Pepi, for King Teti, and for Memre. He was an official for them. So one of the things he talks about, I think is remarkable. He talks about when I was a servant in the king's house. So this is from the 6th dynasty, the autobiography of Winnie. When I was a servant in the king's house, King Menere, he made me vizier for Upper Kemet. And Upper Kemet, as we talked about, is the lower part of Kemet, is the southern part of Kemet. So he's talking about he was a vizier and official in the upper part of Kemet, in the southern part of Kemet. And he said, when I went there, I governed with peace and no one attacked one another. And the king sent me to Iphat, which was a part of Nubia. He sent him to a place in Nubia. And he said to bring back his sarcophagus, which they call the chest of the living, with a lid and a capstone. And the capstone, as I mentioned, was like a small thing that went on the top of the pyramid. So you might have something, we believe, that were on the tops of pyramids and sometimes on the top of obelisks or on the tops of obelisks. And these capstones could be made out of some very fine, beautiful, precious stones that probably were shiny, that were polished, that could reflect the sun's light and really give you a significant capturing, if you will, capping off this humongous monument that you had. So this capstone, he's talking about he was sent to bring back a capstone, and this capstone was going to be covered with, a lot of times they had them covered with electrum, which was a mixture of gold and silver and that type of thing. So he said this was being done. He was bringing back this capstone and this sarcophagus for the pyramid that's called Memory Appears in Splendor. And so he's talking about actually bringing back resources from Nubia, because that's where he said he went from Nubia to King Memory to bring him farther up, back up in northern part of Kemet, so that could be a part of the pyramid. And he talks about how he does it. He said, when he didn't, he also brought back a false door. He brought back something made of granite. And he talks about how this was something that was remarkable because he did it in a short period of time. And he talks about that, I traveled north with them to the pyramid, carrying them with 6 barges. So they made barges and 3 towboats for a single trip. So he's saying this was a remarkable thing because he made barges. He also even made canals in the southern part of Kemet, because apparently the king wanted him to make canals around the first cataract so that they can easily quarry things and get resources that they might need for temples and for pyramids. And he was there and he utilized and worked with Nubian people to help do this. So he talks about that in his autobiography. And he said, nothing like this was ever done. He talks about there were towboats from this place in Ibhab, and that he was in Yebu, which is the farthest south town in that part of southern Kemet, and that nothing like this had been done. And he goes on, and I talk more about this, and I'll go more and talk about his autobiography, but he goes on to say how this was a remarkable thing that he did because it was something that hadn't been done, and that he got the kings and the great ones, if you will, from ancient Kemet, from those who were part of the leadership in Nubia to help him. So apparently they were kind of like boss, and they were in control. They were powerful, and they had people there helping them to source for the resources for this pyramid that was going to be a part of Memory's pyramid. So as we start to think about this, and we started to kind of put this together, you start to see that the Great Pyramids were built by a number of different hands, and when he tells us, which after the time of the Great Pyramid, he tells us that, he's going to other places and he's quarrying for stones. He's getting the capstone. He's getting the leaders of other areas in the southern part of Kemet to join him in building the boats and getting the resources to bring this back at a king in the 6th dynasty, at the king's command. So it's not surprising for us when we think about ancient Kemet Kemet, not just the pyramids themselves, but their temples throughout time, they were used in a way where they were sourcing materials from all over the place. If you take a look at ancient Kemet and you look at temples farther on in the New Kingdom, like 1500 BC or thereabouts, 1,000 years after this was built, and even beyond that, you will find priests wearing panther skins that come from farther south in Central Africa, from animals that are in Central Africa. Panther skins, ivory. You see them using myrrh. You see them using ebony. You see them using cedar wood from Sinai and the East. You find them using all kinds of resources, but in particular, you see a lot of resources from farther south in Africa. There was a trade network that went on that fed into this whole idea of offering, this whole idea of having holy implements that you used in rituals as a part of people's service, and people call them cults, if you will, after they died. There was a whole process that went, a whole priesthood that supported the temples, that supported the tombs, that supported the pyramids. And these resources came from places that they call holy lands, places that were significant, and they had resources that were befitting of God. So not only did they go to places like Punt, but they went to places in Central Africa and got other things, like I mentioned, like the ivory and the panther skins and gold, some of which they got from their own place, but some of which they got from farther south. So this becomes something that as we start to think about this becomes something that jumps out at us, right? That the pyramids were made in a way that there was a whole lot of organization. There was a great deal of organization that went into it, and it was a great deal of labor, and it was a great deal of coordination. So when you think about this is science, right? So we may not know exactly how they build the ramps. We think they were ramps that they built to give up to the levels to be able to place these stones, because these are, like we said, huge stones. To be able to place these stones that high up, how you get that high up, we don't 100% know. We think that maybe they had embankments made of earth and of ramps to get up the high. We think. We do not really know. We do know from their own testaments that they use barges and boats, like I just showed you. Like, from example, from this autobiography of Winnie, who talked about a later period, we do know that they use boats to help transmit. We do know there were some parts of the Nile and the Nile Valley that are dry today that may not have been dry at that time, so maybe they had a little more access to it. So we know that you use boats, they use barges, and they had a huge complex of people that were working for them. This wasn't just like this was a few people. Obviously, as you know, this wasn't just a few people who were doing this. This was a massive labor force. You're talking thousands of people who participated in this for years, who participated in this. So when you think about that, that's a level of organization. When you're moving things like this and you are, building boats and burying boats, there's a whole complex here. They're burying boats. They have all kinds of stuff that they're burying. I'll stop this right here. You'll see that if you look right here, these little slits that you see, these are actual boat buried. They have actually on the side, you can find where they bury boats that help to carry King Khufu's soul symbolically with respect to Ra, because there was a whole theology around and belief around Ra being able to carry in a boat at nighttime and to be able to basically rise again every night after the nighttime's there and the sun rises again. But there's a whole part of this. So you have an organization, a labor force, and to bring this many people. So you had people who were dedicated workers, who were craftsmen, as I said, who were mathematicians, who were draftsmen, architects, people who had to be skilled at shaping the stones and building this whole complex, because they were not just building the pyramid, they were building the temples that go along with the pyramid. So you had people who were dedicated to do that, and you had dedicated craftsmen in a lot of these places, like the Valley of the Kings, much later on in the New Kingdom. But then you also had sometimes people who might have been conscripted at times when there was a certain time of the year where you didn't have as much work to do. So let's say the inundation of the Nile had already taken place, and you had your fields are being watered, and there's a period of time where there's not as much harvesting to do or planting to do, just because of the nature of the cycles of what's going on. Some people may have been conscripted, so they may have been temporary workers, but people were paid, and they were organized into groups. We know that they were Friends of Khufu was one of the groups. They were organized into groups. You had people who maybe were over a couple hundred people, and they were a working group, and they were assigned to do one particular thing, and then another few hundred people may have been assigned to do another particular thing. And this took decades, we believe, to build. So this is a level of organization and sophistication that's remarkable. We know they're bringing resources from farther south. And when we think about this, I wonder why. How is it that they are able to put together this level of organization where it had to be hard work? I mean, there's no way this is not backbreaking work. This is literally hard work. You also had, and this is important to mention, you also had medical attention. So some of the earliest documented medical, and I'm not just talking about, and it's okay, I'm not talking about simply spiritual medicine, which is completely okay, so I'm not dissing that at all, but some of the earliest, which we would call logical medicine, are documented in ancient Kemet. And one of the reasons you might imagine is because they're dealing with these huge stones and they're dealing with people listening. You're going to have people breaking bones, you're going to have people having all kinds of injuries. So you have actual documented. Edwin Smith papyrus is one. It's dated to after this, but that's one example of how they would look at people and say, if you see a person presenting with this type of injury, a neck injury or a spine injury or a leg injury, approach them in this way. You set it this way. You do whatever you need to. So they had a whole systematic way of looking at medical advice and medical attention, because in order to do that, you can't do an operation like this without having medical attention. So you have physicians as well as architecture and craftsmen and people doing the work and the labor for this in a major organized way. Why is it that we can't do it now? A lot of us are motivated by, obviously we're motivated by money, right? You need to eat, right? And so you can bring people together for that, but it's harder to bring people together on a mission and a goal. It's harder, it seems, for us to do that. And I think that the idea of doing something for a greater cause, the idea of being motivated for that, and people were probably, not happy about this. Not everybody was happy about probably doing the hard work, but the idea of being able to get a massive amount of people together to do something on this scale that might last forever, with the idea that it will last forever, is an incredible goal. It's an incredible thing to think about. And we may have people who do it in certain ways and do it like in their jobs, but it's amazing that they could bring people together. I think about some of the amazing things we have and hard things we have to deal with today, like climate change and racism and all kinds of things, where it's hard to get, even for climate change, even just for helping, the environment and helping people who are suffering, and in places where they're really feeling the impact now, and places where all over we're feeling the impact, to be able to massively get together and organize to do something like that. There's something we can learn from the ancient Kemetic people. There's something we can learn from our ancients, the ability to organize, to bring people together around the cause, and to do something that lives forever. So I just wanted to share that. I hope if you have any questions, you put it down below. You let me know what you think. And if there's more things you want to know, please let me know. Thank you so much for looking at this. Please share this with somebody, and I'll talk to you soon. Talk to you later.